Georgie and I'm a freelance senior motion graphics artist specialising in kinetic typography. In the past I've worked with clients such as the BBC, Nike and Adidas. Today I've teamed up with Type 1 to bring you my tutorial on my top 5 kinetic typography techniques within After Effects. All of these techniques are really simple to pick up, but I'll be showing you how if you build them on top of each other, you'll be creating really interesting videos with them. So let's jump straight in. Okay, so for this first technique, I'm going to be showing you quite a simple technique, but once you know how to create it, you can implement it in lots of different ways. So I'm going to be showing you how to animate text tracking in After Effects. So we're going to start with creating a new type layer. So I'm going to press Command T to get my type tool up, and then I'm going to click and drag a box out and I'm going to write tracking. And for this tutorial I'm going to be using Founders Grotesque font in bold. I'm going to make sure that the text is relatively small on the screen, so I think I'm going to make it 150. So we've got room to animate the tracking either side, and I'm going to align this in the middle horizontally and vertically, and I'm going to move my anchor point so it's in the middle. So I'm going to press Y, hold down Command and move it, and it clicks up in the middle. You can see that box appear around it. So if I hit the V button to get my mouse tool back, and I'm going to go to my text layer and just drop down my layer information here by pressing that arrow. And I'm going to go here to where it says animate and press this arrow here. And what this is, these are loads of different parameters that we can add to this text layer to animate. So we want to animate the tracking. So I'm going to click tracking. And you can see here immediately you have animator 1 comes up, and you've got tracking amount, tracking type. The only thing we're going to change here is the tracking amount. And you can just click and drag this out, and immediately you can start to see that the spacing between the letters starts to animate in and out. Now, if we were to change the paragraph to, say, a line on the left, when it animates, it will be animating from the left. And the same goes for if it was on the right as well. But for the purpose of this, we want to have it in the middle. And to animate this, I'm just going to simply hit the 0 button to put it back to 0, click the stopwatch tool to bring up a keyframe, move along in my timeline slightly, animate it out so it hits the edges, and it automatically creates a new keyframe, go along in my timeline again and animate it back to 0. Now I already know that this is going to be quite a simple animation. We want to add maybe a bit more bounce to those keyframes. So I'm going to highlight the keyframe, go to my graph editor and add some easing in and out for each keyframe. You can see here that this keyframe is highlighted, so this handle is highlighted, and I'm going to click and drag it down and pull out my handle. I'm going to do the same for the middle one and try and make it as equal as you can, obviously by eye, and do it the same for these ones as well. And all we're doing here is we're telling the keyframes to ease in to the animation, and this is going to be the height of the speed of the animation is going to be in the middle, and it's going to ease back out to this keyframe, and then do the same for these two. So if I play that, I'm going to show you what it looks like. And you can see here it's got that sort of bounce as it hits the edges and bounce back. And I want to also loop this out forever. So hold down Option and hit the stopwatch button here. And I'm going to type loop, and already you can see that the expression pops up at the bottom. So we want loop out with these brackets, and inside the brackets we want to put a quote mark, and we want to put cycle, and again it's popped up here for me so I don't have to type it out. I can just go down the list here and then press enter, and we've got our expression, and that's literally looping out those first keyframes that we've created, and it just keeps going until the end of the layer. Now this is a nice animation in itself, but what we can do is we can start adding to this. So if I was to duplicate this layer, and because we haven't animated the position keyframes, I can move this about and it's still going to have the same animation as it has before, and that doesn't interrupt that. But we don't want it to be up there. I mean, you could move it up there, but for the purpose of this tutorial, I'm going to actually just move it up, and I'm going to copy this and create the word tracking from the top to the bottom repeated. So I'm going to do that now. There we go. So if I was to play that now, they would all do exactly the same thing. But if we were to offset these layers by, say, 2 frames, so highlight all of these bottom ones apart from the top one and move them along in the timeline by 2 keyframes. And I'm going to keep going until I have done them all. I don't want it to start with just the top one on the screen. I want it to start where they're all on the screen. So if I just move them along until they're all on the screen and hit play, you can see you can get this funky, delayed animation to it. Okay, so on to my second technique. And for this one, I'm going to be showing you how to create scrolling text around an object or a shape. So for this tutorial, I'm going to show you with a square, but you can easily use whatever shape you want. So a circle or a triangle or a hexagon or whatever shape you want it to be. As long as you've got that path set, you can have text scrolling around anything. So I'm going to hit Command T to get my text box up, and I'm going to make a big box in the middle. We might need to extend this out either side, but we'll come back to that a bit later on. And I'm going to use 40 pixels for this so that the text is a bit smaller. And I'm going to type out scrolling, and I'm going to make sure there's some spaces at the end of this. So I'm going to put about 4 spaces, but again, it doesn't matter. You can choose how many spaces you want. I'm going to hit Command A to highlight all of that, Command C to copy it, and then Command V to paste it. And I'm going to keep pasting this until it fills the whole box. And I'm going to zoom out a bit and extend that box out so we've got a bit more room to add a few more. Okay, cool. So I'm going to center this in the middle of my composition, and then I'm going to get my shape tool up. So I've got the rectangle tool here, so I'm going to create a shape. So I'm going to click, drag it down and create a square. And in order to align this to the middle, we can zoom in, hit the quote marks to get our safe guides up and see where the center of our composition is. Double click the mask and you can see the anchor point is in the middle, and just drag it into the middle like that. Can turn off our safeguards now. Now if we go to our text layer and drop down the arrow here where it says text, and then path options, and we can go to our path and we can select our mask, and immediately you can see that the text is around where the mask shape is. And it's actually, we need our text to be a little bit longer. So if you find this happens to you, you can just turn off the path, scroll out a bit, get our text box up and drag the box out, and we can add a few more scrolls in there. And it might mean that we go back to our mask, we turn it on, and actually we find that there's too much in here. And this is going to take a bit of refinement, so going back and forth. And I'm going to highlight a few scrolls and delete them. And I'm probably going to delete an extra one. And now there's slight space here, so we can highlight it all by pressing Command A, going to our type size and bringing it up by point increments. So I'm going to put 0.1, that's not enough, 0.2, and I think that's probably enough. And you just play around with that size, it doesn't have to be exact, just as long as it fills the box. So in order to animate this, we're going to adjust the first margin or the last margin. Again, it doesn't matter which one, because by doing both of them, it animates in both ways. So you just pick one and put a keyframe in at the beginning and a keyframe at say 5 seconds, and let's put it at 300 and press play. And you can see it's scrolling, and it's scrolling quite slowly, so that we can put that up to, put it at 1000. And now that you have that basic knowledge of animating along a mask, you can then add that to different elements. So we can add some scale keyframes at the beginning here. And we can say, so I'm going to press Option S to get my scale keyframe up here. And I can go to the beginning and put 0. And then I can adjust these keyframes. So highlight one of them, go to our graph, and we can get it to go really quick at the beginning and then ease out to 100%. So when we press play, it looks something like that. And then we can duplicate this layer and move it along in the timeline by a few frames. And instead of getting to 100%, we could make that 90%. Oh, so my anchor point isn't in the middle, so when I've done that, it's actually scaling down to here. So if I press back and move the anchor point to the middle, so press Y, holding down Command and moving it to the middle, and it clicks into place there. So now if we were to put 90% here, it goes into the middle, and we can keep doing this. So we can duplicate this several times, bringing down the scale by 10%, and you start to get an interesting pattern. So I'm gonna do that now. And we start to get this really interesting pattern that we've built from a very simple animation, but it's all about layering these techniques up on top of each other. So on to the third technique, where I'll be showing you how to animate the outline of a text stroke. Now, in order to do this, we're going to get our text tool up again, so Command T, and we're gonna make a box, and let's put mask. And I'm going to make this a lot bigger because we'll have it in the middle of the screen. And I'm going to center it. And if I right click on this text layer and go to create masks from text, so I'm going to click that. And immediately you can see that the text layer has gone. So we've got the text layer underneath and it's been turned off. And we've got a layer which is a solid, and it's got 5 masks on it because you've got the A in 2 separate masks so that you've got this middle bit taken out. Now what we can do here is we can add an effect called stroke. And if I type it up here in my effects and presets panel, and I double click on stroke to get it put onto my mask layer, and I can click here all masks and change the paint style to reveal original image. And once I've done that, you can immediately see that you've got your outlines here, and you can play with the settings. So you've got your brush size, which determines the size of the brush itself. So what's going to be revealed. So the larger I go, the more it's going to reveal of what is underneath, and in our case it's the solid layer. So let's make this say 4, so that we've got a 4 pixel outline of this text. Now we can start to animate this with these parameters here, so your start and end point. And if I just show you by moving the end point, it's immediately revealing the stroke that it's doing one by one. It's going through, and it's doing it one by one because you've got stroke sequentially turned on. So if I unclick that, it's going to do them all each individually at the same time. So I'll show you those 2 different ways by animating it. So end, and I've put that at 0, and I'm going to go to 1% and make that 100. So if we play that through, you can see that it's doing them all at the same time. But if I was to turn stroke sequentially on and I press play, it's doing it one by one. And again, what you can see here, I'm going to get my keyframes up and just drag this out. They're actually starting at all different points, and the points that they're starting at is the first point of the mask, which is shown here by this larger circle around the circle. So that is the first point it's going to start at. If you want to change where the mask starts, you can actually move it. So you can click any point in your mask. So I'm going to click up here, right click it, goes to mask and shape path and set first vertex. And you can do that for each one of these. Again, the K is starting down here. I don't particularly like that, so I'm going to move that to the top. Up here, right click, go to mask and path, set first vertex. So if I press play, it looks something like that. And it's obviously going really quickly because our keyframes are really close together. So the more I drag it out, the slower it will become. And obviously as well, you can look at your graph editor and we can play around with the speed. So right now that is a linear keyframe, which means that from one point to the other, it's going to get there in a very straight line, essentially, in terms of its animation. So we can right click it and we can tell it to ease in at the beginning and ease in at the end using our graph editor. When we come back out, let's see what that looks like. And again, so once we've got that base animation done, we can then add to it different elements to it. So if I was to duplicate this solid layer and move it along in the timeline slightly, but actually if I hit Command Shift Y, that brings up the solid settings, and I can change the color to red. And we can do it again. We can move it along in the timeline and we can press Command Shift Y and change the color to blue. And again, we can keep going and we can do lots of different iterations to this one animation. And let's see what that looks like. And we've taken a really simple animation and just made it that much more interesting. Okay, so moving on to the fourth technique where I'm going to be showing you how to animate with 3D text. Now the possibilities for this technique are massive and there's so many things that you can do with it, but I'm going to just show you how simple it is to create some text and turn it into 3D elements. So I'm going to get my text tool up again and I'm going to type 3D. And for this one, again, I'm going to align it in the middle and I'm going to move my anchor point by pressing Y, holding down Command and moving it into the middle. To turn it 3D, all we need to do is go to our layer and click the 3D button, which is just shown by that 3D box above it. So I'm going to click that and immediately we've got a 3D layer. And once I press the arrow down, you can see you've already got some options that appear here. You've got your change render settings. So currently it's on classic 3D, but you can change it to Cinema 4D. Which adds some additional elements, but also, as you can see here, it disables some other elements. So if, for instance, if you want to use a 3D layer with track mats or blend modes or anything like that, then you'd need to be using classic 3D. But if you want to create a 3D object and extruding it or adding beveled elements to it, then you'd need to have Cinema 4D. So for this, I'm going to be using Cinema 4D because I don't need to use any of these additional elements. So I'm going to hit OK. And I'm going to go to transform. And again, you've got your rotation turned into X, Y, and Z. And this is the bit that I find really interesting because you can start to change the way the text looks perspectively with just some really simple and easy techniques. So for instance, I'm going to go along in my timeline. I'm going to put an X rotation keyframe in here. And I'm going to just animate it so it looks like it pops in. So -90, and then go along in my timeline for a bit, put a new keyframe in, and then put +90. So again, we can adjust these keyframes a bit in the timeline and go to my graph editor, and I'm going to get it to start off quickly and ease into the middle bit. So that's adding a strong ease in and ease out. So if I hit play, you can see what this looks like. And it just makes it that much more interesting without it just being a simple sort of move into position or anything like that. And then you can start adding this up. So we can copy this layer and we can move it along in the timeline by pressing this square bracket. And you can change what this text says. So let's say 2D, like that. And I'm going to end the layer here. And if I hit play, you'll see what that looks like. So we go from 3D and it spins into 2D and it spins into 3D because it's a loop. So we've already created this really interesting animation by a really simple technique using 3D. And if we want to push this further, so say we want to extrude this layer out so that the text doesn't look flat, we can go to our geometry options because we've changed our renderer from classic 3D to Cinema 4D. And you can see here in geometry options, you've got bevel style, you've got bevel depth, whole bevel depth, and you've got extrusion depth. So immediately we want to go to extrusion depth and make that, let's make that say 100. And you can see that slight change there. So if I go back again, so 0 and the 3 looks like a normal 3. As soon as you hit 100, it sort of extends itself out. Now, if I was to move this in rotation, let's move it to Y so you can see a bit more what's going on. You can see that it's extruded, but because it's all white, you can't see what the text actually is. So in order to change this, we can go to animate here, right click, and we can go to side and add a color. So let's go to RGB, and immediately you've got this sort of animator appear, and you can change the color. So we can change it to let's change it to a light gray, so 230, 230, 230. And immediately there you've got this slightly different color on the edges, so you can make out what the word says. And there's all sorts of things that you can add to this. So if you go to your animator again and you go to right and you go to side, you've got your diffuse, you've got specular, you've got metal, you've got reflection, And you've got all these different things that you can add to that side to make it that a bit more interesting. And because you're in After Effects, you can then layer this up and you can add sort of textures on top of this text, so it's not so flat and white and grey and sort of graphical if you wanted to have a bit more texture added to it. Let's move this back to 0. So you've got it going from a more 3D object to a 2D object. And you can see here when it's moving, it actually looks like the anchor point is at the very front, which it is. So we can move that by going to the layer. And here, because we're in 3D mode, your anchor point and your position will have this additional number appear here. And this is moving in the Z space. So in your Z space means from the front to, say, the back of the composition, rather than up and down or across. So if I was to move this anchor point, you're going to start to see the text move and the anchor point move. And we can just do this by 50 because we know the extrusion depth is 100. And so now if we go back here and press play, we see it moving a little bit better than it was before. Okay, so for my 5th and final technique, I'm going to be showing you something that's relatively simple, but is really interesting to use in sort of more long form videos, and just a nice technique to have underneath your belt. And what I'll be showing you is how to reveal text in the middle of the screen as it sort of jumps out of a box or a mask shape. So I'm going to type jump in the middle here, and I'm going to create, so I'm going to move that to the middle, align it vertically and horizontally, and I'm going to create a box. So make sure that the layer isn't highlighted, because if you've got it clicked here and you've got your shape tool, it's going to create a mask, and we don't want a mask created, we want a box created above it. So I'm going to just go over the top, making sure that the whole thing is covered. And as you can see here, we can still see jump underneath, and that's because my fill is turned off. So just make sure your fill is turned on. And then if you click your layer and you go to where it says track matte, if you can't see mode and track matte here, go to the top of your timeline, right click on that layer, go to columns, and then just make sure you've got mode switched on, because as soon as you've got mode switched on, you've got your track matte switched on as well. So if I click none and I go down to alpha matte shape layer 1 and I click it, it suddenly reveals the text and what it's saying. So if I move this jump down, it starts to disappear, because wherever that box is, this text will be shown within it. So as soon as the text moves outside the box, it will be hidden. So to animate this, all we need to do is animate the position. So let's put a position keyframe in here by pressing Option P. Go to the start of our timeline and drag that down. We go a little bit further on from that second keyframe and hit Option P again. And then go along in the timeline again and just move it up and out of that square box. And let's make these keyframes a little bit more interesting. So let's highlight one and let's have them easing out, and this one easing in, and hit play. Cool, and what we can also do is we can add a little jump in here. So right now it sort of animates in and animates out, but we can add a little tiny jump. So let's move this in slightly, and we might want to make this, let's position this equally in the middle and just extend it out just slightly, and add a keyframe to our text layer here. Go back in our timeline slightly and just move it up a little bit, and double check our graph editor. So we want this to ease in like that. And let's see what that looks like. And immediately you've got a little bit more of an interesting animation there by having that small bounce back, and you can just play with the keyframes to make it different for you, or to have that different feel. And again, once you have your base animation, you can add different details to it to create a new animation or something just a bit more interesting. So for this one, we are going to actually add a mask around the letter J. So once you've added your mask around the first layer, you want to duplicate both the text layer and the shape layer together, because they're connected by that track matte. So if they are apart, then text won't be hidden once it goes out of that shape box. So make sure that you highlight both of them, press Command D to duplicate it, and then we'll move the top 2 layers along the timeline slightly, and then we'll double click the mask, and we're going to move the mask to reveal the U, and we'll do that for each letter. Cool, so once we've done that, you can see here that we've taken a really simple animation and just added a slightly new angle to it to make it much more interesting. And you can do that for all of these techniques. You can start off with something really simple, but by adding different layers to them, you then start to get some really interesting outcomes. Cool, and that's it for today's tutorial. Thanks for watching. Do let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you decide to create anything from this, pop it on Instagram and make sure you tag myself and Type 1 into your posts, and we'll be sure to reshare them in our stories. That's all for now. Thank you.